Hello, students in LDRD 613. This is going to be the first of a few presentations, voiceover PowerPoint presentations that I'll be doing and posting to the shell. And these presentations are intended to share different perspectives and different ideas when it comes to social and environmental responsibility. This one obviously is entitled Socially and Environmentally Responsible Leadership, and it was actually a presentation that I was invited to do at one of our Mexican partners in Puebla, Mexico last March. I presented to 1,200 undergraduates and tried to get some ideas to them about socially and environmentally responsible leadership. So I will share that presentation with you and go through it, but do keep in mind that it was written for undergraduates. While it does contain relevant ideas for us, it still is geared more towards an undergraduate audience. The first thing I wanted to do in this presentation was to define leadership. And if you've spent any time in the LDRD program or the Educational Leadership Program, this is going to be familiar material to you. But I wanted to try to get a point across the points that leadership is in fact influence, and that a leader influences people and events towards a desired goal. This was also to sort of open the idea that leadership can be practiced by everyone because it is not necessarily related to one's position. It is more related to one's duties and one's sort of disposition. This led them to the idea that they could also be leaders, and that they in fact probably are in some aspect of their lives. When we think about leadership, we oftentimes think about leaders in business, and most often we think about leaders in business as being managers, directors, presidents, or some other sort of positional title. But leadership in business is really to help the business be successful, and that can be done at many different levels. Unfortunately, that usually has meant expanded profits and market share. Those have been the primary drivers of what leaders in business are tasked with doing. But is that enough? Is there more that we should be doing? This gets us down to the question of why we are in business. Are we in business just to make money? Is that the only reason for being in business? If that's the case, then what does this mean for the employees and their families, the communities that we work in, the environment where we get our products, the other businesses that we work with, and the generations that are to follow? So when we think about business and leadership in business, we have to sort of broaden our viewpoint. And we are at a place in our history where we must think about leadership in business from both a socially and environmentally responsible place. That leads us to actually considering the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line is actually a way of leading an organization so that we focus equally on the people that are part of the organization, the planet where we get our products and where we dispose of our waste, and the profits. And smart companies are discovering that all three of these things need to be taken into account if the company is going to be successful and if it's going to appeal to a broad group of stakeholders. Triple bottom line leadership means that we have to be responsible business leaders, and we must conduct business and conduct our lives in a manner that does not substantially detract from the ability of future generations to enjoy a similar or even better standard of living. Some may ask if we're not already doing that by growing the business. Aren't we financially able to better support future generations if the business world is stronger? That is where the crux of the argument really lies in sustainability, because it's not just the financial side. There will not be a financial side if we just continue to focus on the financial side. So that's where we have to talk about the social issues and the environmental issues if we want to sustain the financial side. So this brings up the question, so what really is the need for socially and environmentally responsible leadership? And why do we need to adopt sustainable business practices? And probably the most important question, and the thing that has probably prevented sustainability from taking root, at least in this country and in many other parts of the world, is won't this hurt business? Don't we see sustainability as being sort of a contrary to business success or the opposite of business success, and if we embrace one, we necessarily have to let go of the other one? In this class, we will talk about the fact that, or many reasons why that's just not true. If we embrace sustainability, we have a chance of actually growing or at least not hurting the businesses that we lead. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly sustainable business is. In truth, it's a way of doing business that can continue in the long term because it uses largely renewable or reusable resources. It burns less fossil fuels, which we all know are not renewable. It puts out less waste. It respects ecological balances. But beyond those environmental issues, it also considers economic distribution and it addresses a number of social problems. So those are some pretty lofty goals, but that's really what sustainable business is being able to do business in the long run in a way that does not impact the future of others in a negative way. So now that we have an idea of what sustainable business is, why is it important? Well, think about what happens when we don't practice environmentally responsible leadership. What happens actually is we create great damage to the systems of our world. And in truth, we've come to rely on a number of practices over the last decades and even centuries that we can no longer sustain because the planet simply can't take it anymore. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through some environmental examples, and then we'll switch gears a little bit and we'll take a look at some examples of social ills and see why these two things are so closely linked together. So I'll run through each of these slides fairly quickly, but it just gives you some example of some of the environmental and then social ills that we're facing today. The first one is solid waste. The world, of course, produces billions of tons of solid waste annually, and most of this goes into landfills. The landfills are a problem because, one, they take up huge amounts of land. They're basically giant canyons of garbage. They are covered with dirt. As the garbage decomposes, it releases methane gas, which is 21 times stronger or more effective as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And the waste seeps into water systems oftentimes when the garbage decomposes. Another big problem is plastic. Plastic is used in many different products. Probably the most common we see is plastic bottles. But as plastic breaks down and is thrown away, plastic waste becomes smaller and smaller, and this waste is being found in many locations on land and in the oceans. Plastic takes hundreds of years to break down, and what they're actually finding is that there's a giant plastic sort of island, if you will, that is floating in the Pacific, where the water currents have actually driven the plastic sort of this in this central location in the Pacific Ocean. And they're also finding a number of plastic particles in a number of different types of fish. Another problem is electronic waste. More than 90% of computers, TVs, video and auto recorders, PDAs, and all those other electronic tools that we use end up in landfills. In the third world, these almost exclusively end up in landfills. In the U.S., more often than not, we're seeing electronic recycling centers spring up, and this is to actually scrap some of the metals and stuff out of these materials that are becoming increasingly hard to find in the earth. We already know that cars are a problem because of the emission of carbon dioxide and the contribution to the greenhouse gas effect. But automobiles, once they're taken off the road, are a significant problem as well. About 20 to 30 million cars are taken off the road each year, and most of those in developing countries just end up in landfills. Industrial pollution has been a problem since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's still a huge problem, despite the number of controls on air pollution in the Western world. But it's not so controlled in areas like Asia and in specifically India and China, where industrial pollution is a huge problem. Right now, giant clouds of industrial pollution are covering entire regions of the world. This is causing health problems for thousands of people that live there. As an example of the result of industrial pollution, I included this slide which basically showed a sunny day in Beijing. The weather on this particular day that I took this picture from my hotel room was supposed to be sunny, and what really is kind of clouding everything up is industrial pollution, which seems to center right in Beijing. This says in recent weeks, but it was basically last winter. Residents of Beijing were told to stay inside because their air quality was actually dangerous. Another problem that we're facing a lot, especially in the third world, is water and land pollution. 70% of the developing world's untreated industrial waste is simply dumped into rivers, lakes, oceans, or just dumped out on the ground. And that, of course, has downstream effects and, of course, soil effects in those regions. Of course, we've all heard the problems with oil, and we'll talk quite a bit more about the impact of the oil and oil industries on the environment later on in the course. But the one reality is that world and oil gas reserves are likely or predicted to be unable to keep up with the demand in the next 25 years. That's simply going to drive up prices and have other downstream effects. And coal is a huge problem. Coal burns very dirty. It puts out very dirty smoke. And much of the pollution that we saw in that picture of Beijing was actually coal smoke. But the problem with coal is that there's a ton of it. there's a lot of coal left, and we could be using the coal at the current consumption rates. We'd be using it for 250 years, but the world simply just can't tolerate the use of coal because it is so dirty. The world has a good supply of coal, but it is a huge polluter, and it's used to generate electricity not only in places like India and China, but also in the southeastern United States. We up in the Pacific Northwest are lucky because we have big rivers that generate our electricity, but where they don't have those rivers, they depend largely on coal-fired power plants to actually generate their electricity. We've also often heard of problems with access to clean drinking water. And even to this day, 1/3 of the world's population does not have access to clean drinking water. Much of what once was available is now polluted. Another example is a key food source for many coastal communities, and that's fisheries or fish. Over 70% of the world's fisheries are chronically overfished, and some of them have just collapsed. They've been so overfished that they just cannot recover, and many of the species likely will never recover. There's also been some significant damage done to forests, and about 1/3 of the forests in the world have disappeared and another third are in danger. Forests are pretty important in the absorption of greenhouse gases, and we'll talk about greenhouse gases on the next slide. But forests actually are a process when, as trees grow, they actually sequester carbon, which reduces the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So losing forests is a big deal. But as we hear in the news, and as many of us have heard about or learned about, probably our biggest challenge right now is carbon dioxide. And the reason for that is that the burning of carbon fuels, carbon-based fuels such as oil and coal, releases carbon atoms into the atmosphere. Those carbon atoms bond with oxygen atoms, creating carbon dioxide. This is a problem because most of that carbon has been captured or sequestered for long periods of time in the earth. And as we burn it, we release that carbon, and that, again, creates the carbon dioxide, which is trapping the sun's energy and creating a warming planet. So an increase in carbon emissions is believed by most of the world scientists to be causing global climate change. And I had mentioned that the forests played an important part. Forests also sequester carbon. And actually, as forests, trees, plants, whatever grow, they take in carbon dioxide, they strip out the carbon atom, and they release oxygen. So they hold that carbon sort of prisoner, and it can't bond with oxygen, and it can't create carbon dioxide. So the destruction of forests is only compounding a problem that we've already created by burning so much fossil fuels. Carbon dioxide is actually measured on a parts per million basis. And for many thousands of years, and there's scientific methods to prove this, the level of carbon dioxide was about 280 parts per million. And that held fairly steady until about the middle of the 19th century, when we started to see the level of carbon dioxide ratchet up. About the middle of the 20th century, carbon dioxide just shot through the roof. And at the time that I wrote this slide, the current atmospheric carbon level was 399.64 parts per million. Most scientists believe that we need to stay under 350 parts per million to avoid any significant and substantial changes to our climate and our temperatures. And since the middle of the 20th century, as we've dumped increasing amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, we're starting to see the effects. And some of these effects are pretty subtle, but we've certainly seen them in the retreat of glaciers. And this is an example of a glacier. It's the Muir Glacier in Alaska. Pictures from 1941 and 2004. And there's a pretty extreme example there of the impacts of global climate change. Another area where we're likely to see the impacts of climate change is in the number of storms that we see on an annual basis and the ferocity of those storms. A good example was Hurricane Sandy. It was the first time that I can remember a hurricane making its way into Manhattan up through New York City. And I think that's probably going to be something similar to what we see as the years go on. There'll be more fierce storms further north. So with the consideration of global climate change, what might the future look like? Well, right now to date, the average global temperature has already risen 0.8 degrees Celsius, which seems like a pretty small amount. But one has to remember that there's a very precarious balance of the different forces in the climate that has been sustained for thousands of years, and it is very susceptible to small changes. So as we increase the amount of greenhouse gases and as the temperature continues to rise, it is predicted that the temperature could rise as much as 6 full degrees centigrade. And if that happens, we will likely lose a lot of land due to rising seas. The ice that's sitting on top of Greenland and sitting on top of Antarctica, if that melts, that's going to contribute a whole lot of water to the oceans, and that will raise the seas. We'll lose farmland where it will be too hot to grow crops. We'll lose water sources that have typically come from winter snows. If what comes from the sky and lands on the ground isn't snow anymore, that takes time to melt across, over a long spring, and is just rainwater that runs off, we won't have those water sources anymore. And a lot of species that currently depend on the world's climate will be wiped out, and we're doing a pretty good job of that right now. Now, the challenging thing to consider is that much of this damage has occurred since 1950. That's about 70, going on 70 years. And as a result of the world, mostly in the West, living in an unsustainable manner as a continuation of a technically focused industrial revolution. As we started the revolution, the Industrial Revolution, we began living in a way that was unsustainable almost from the start. And we've just kind of built on that foundation, and we continue, even in the West, we continue to live in a fairly unsustainable manner. But it's not just environmental challenges that we're going to be looking at in this class. We're also going to be looking at some social challenges. And those also will require intelligent leadership. It's going to require people who are willing to sort of step back from the status quo and business as usual to question some of the social ills and see if there's ways that we can actually address them, both at a local and global level. The first of these is poverty. Great progress has been made in reducing poverty and moving more and more people throughout the world into a middle class. However, as of 2008, 1.29 billion people still lived in absolute poverty, which basically meant that they were living on less than $2 a day. We also still have many issues with health and healthcare around the world, and significant efforts are underway to eliminate disease, but more work needs to be done, especially to ensure the health of women and children. The United Nations in recent decades came out with its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in which it guaranteed the right to a basic education to all citizens. However, many global citizens still don't have access to basic education. And while there may be economic advancements and development going on in various places in the world, too often the benefits of those economic developments are shared with all the members of the communities in which it occurs. And in fact, many of those are put out when economic developments come in. They lose their homes or they lose their farmland, and they do not reap the benefits of those developments. Income disparity has become an increasing problem, and many people don't really recognize that with income disparity comes other issues. Yes, the rich get richer and the rest of us don't, but what's really happening is that it's an unsustainable pattern, because as the rich get richer and hoard more and more of the global wealth, there's less of it to go to the rest of us, and that will cause economic problems, because if we don't have any of the global wealth, we can't spend any money and we can't sustain the economies. So this is actually, this disparity issue is actually a real problem for economic growth around the world. And while there are many other social issues, and I've only touched on 6 in this slide presentation, the last one I will talk about is peace and security. And a good number of the world's citizens face threats both from inside and outside their communities because of political unrest or other oppression that is going on. So that is a lot of problems, and many feel like there's just too much to do. So as a result, they do nothing. They feel like their problems are overwhelming and that they just can't make a difference. How can they possibly do anything that is going to have any impact on so many global problems? But the truth is they can. Through socially and environmentally responsible leadership, they can begin to make a difference. And in this class, we're actually going to talk about a number of ways that you as doctoral students can actually make a difference. But it's going to require intelligent leadership to solve these problems, meaning we're going to have to step out of the status quo. We're going to have to step out of leading the way we've always led and think about the world in different terms and what our role is going to be in that. So at this point in this less than uplifting presentation, you're probably wondering, well, what are the answers? Well, the truth is, I don't have them. I don't have all these answers. It took us decades and even centuries to get into these problems, and it's going to take us time to get out. The problem is we don't have decades to get out of these problems, especially with the carbon emissions problem. We need to solve that one relatively quickly, and we don't have time to the same amount of time it took to get into this problem. So we're going to have to act fairly quickly. So what can we do? Well, we can start by raising awareness. People can't help solve problems if they don't know that they exist. Hopefully, this class is going to raise your awareness and you can sort of carry that message forward. We can change our own behavior. If all of us changed our own behavior, we could have a substantial impact on some of the problems that we have talked about in this presentation. Then we could work to change the behavior of our organizations, whether they be school systems or businesses. This is going to require leaders that know about these issues. It's going to require leaders that see how to lead enterprises that are both responsible and profitable at the same time. And it's going to require leaders who can develop future leaders who are equally aware of these issues. And we have to remember that we can only take one small step at a time. We can't try to solve all the world's problems in one swell swoop. To do this, we need leaders. Dealing with our social and environmental problems is going to require leadership on many levels. It will need to be the next big movement. And big movements have often required great leaders, but they also require leaders on the ground and at many levels who are ready to do the real work that needs to get done. It'll require ordinary citizens who can make a difference in a rapidly transforming world. And it's clear that we cannot continue to lead in ways that we traditionally have. But how will we lead, and to what ends? So we need intelligent business leadership, and I would just say that this is intelligent leadership overall. This initial presentation was focused for business students, so I included the business piece here, but it's really just intelligent leadership. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the mission of our organization? Is it to make money, or is it to fill a social need, or is it both? Are we leading in a way that will not detract from the ability of future generations to enjoy a similar or better standard of living? Are we considering the ends of our company's actions? What impacts are we having? And how can we contribute to the social well-being of our own communities or our environment? And we probably need to find out if the actions that our organization is taking, is it part of the solution or part of the problem? Keep in mind that this presentation was done for undergraduates, but I would substitute undergraduate business student for doctoral level leadership student in this slide and apply the same question to each of you. You're just a doctoral student. You're a single doctoral student. What can you do? Remember some of the basic tenets of leadership. Leadership is everyone's business, and leadership is influence. We can all have influence in areas we care about, even if it's limited. Even if we're not in a position where we can tell a company that it has to change its ways so it becomes more socially and environmentally responsible, we can influence organizations, whether they be school systems or companies, in small ways. Intelligent leadership is intelligent influence. And if not today, if you're not in a role today to be able to think about what impact you might be able to have, think about what you might be able to do in the future. And lastly, I invited the undergraduates to think about what their role would be. So then, what influence would they be able to have, however small? They could raise awareness, they could come up with a plan, that plan could lead to action, and that action could possibly lead to results. Those results could actually make a difference. So then I challenged them and asked them what their role would be. So as I've indicated, this presentation was one that I put together for undergraduate business students, but I think many of the topics are very relevant to what we will be talking about in this class. So I offer this presentation up as kind of a basic sort of primer on some of the issues, both environmental and social, that we need to consider. And this will be especially relevant for your first assignment when you will select one of those issues and do a more in-depth study and analysis of it. I invite you to make any comments that you would like to make about this presentation in the discussion forum where this presentation will be posted.